Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
My next guest is Corinne Zupko. Corinne is the author of the best-selling and multi-award-winning book titled From Anxiety to Love. Corinne was diagnosed with her first anxiety disorder at a very young age and struggled with debilitating anxiety for nearly 3 decades. Determined not to let anxiety run her life, she dove into the living principles of the psychological and spiritual text, A Course in Miracles. With the Course and mindfulness meditation as tools on her journey, she has found inner peace to be unstoppable and now teaches others to discover it in themselves. Corinne is a keynote speaker, adjunct professor of counselor education, licensed counselor, coach, and teaches mindfulness meditation classes at Bank of America. Well, Corinne, thank you for joining us here today.
Oh, Dr. Tim, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
I'm thrilled that you agreed to this interview because I have benefited so much from your book and I've shared it with so many people. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and what brings you to this kind of a place where you're an author and a teacher?
Absolutely. So my journey with anxiety began at a very young age. My first psychiatric diagnosis was actually at the age of 2. I was around 1.5, 2 years old when I was diagnosed with separation anxiety disorder. So my poor mother literally could not leave the room without me screaming my head off. And from there, I outgrew the separation anxiety, but it sort of morphed and changed through the years. I remember as a child having a number of different phobias. I had lots of worries. I had lots of fears of losing my parents or getting sick. And when I entered into college, which is a time, the age range when mental health issues surface for a lot of people, it was at that time, it was my sophomore year. This is back in the 90s. And I learned that a student who I didn't actually personally know died very suddenly of meningitis. And I unraveled at the seams. It scared me to my core because illness anxiety was something that had the power to change my day from peaceful to panicked in a snap. If I heard about the latest outbreak of a disease, if somebody was even talking about a particular disease or illness, it would really scare me because I'd be afraid that that would happen to me. So when the student suddenly passed away, and supposedly he was fine the night before and then passed away the next morning, I remember feeling a spike of fear, a spike of anxiety, literally start from like my legs up through my core. And it was just pure terror. And it was during the day. So I talked myself down. I talked myself out of it, just telling myself it was okay. I would be okay. But then I went to bed that night, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up with what felt like a punch in the stomach of stress hormones. And I remember sitting up in my bunk bed, gasping for air, feeling like I couldn't breathe, And I had to walk myself down my bunk bed with my knees so shaky that it felt like I couldn't support my body weight. And I just thought I was going to die. I remember I was sweating, trembling, so scared. And I picked up, we didn't have cell phones back then. So I picked up my room's telephone and dragged it with the wire into the bathroom, which was right across our little corridor. And I called home, and 3 o'clock in the morning, my mom, I joke around that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree because I sleep with like the white noisemaker and the earplugs, and so does my mom. So she blots out all sorts of, any possibility for there to be any noise. But from across the house at 3 o'clock in the morning, through her earplugs, through her white noisemaker, she heard the phone ring and she knew something was up. She picked up the phone and instilled hope in me. Basically, we figured out that I was having my first panic attack, and she instilled hope in me that we would somehow find help. I immediately agreed to get back into therapy. And it was on that phone call when I honestly was so scared that I didn't know if I'd ever feel normal again. And that first anxiety episode, it felt like that panic attack lasted for like 2 weeks. It was very severe. And I didn't know if I would feel better again. It was on that phone call when my mom said, Corinne, I know you haven't wanted to talk about this spiritual pathway that I'm into, but I really think it could help you. And I was like, I will try anything. And that was when my mom offered me a copy of a spiritual book that she was studying called A Course in Miracles. Now I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but the anxiety that I was experiencing, for anybody who's had a panic attack or has had debilitating anxiety, you know how hard it is to convey the depth of the fear to somebody who's never experienced a panic attack. There's something that you just can't put into words with how terrifying it can be. Not only does anxiety hijack our thinking, but there's the physiological piece as well, where our body, I felt my body just in a state of contraction. I was constantly feeling like my stomach was in a knot, upside down even, trembling. My knees and my legs would get very tingly. So it's a full body and mind experience, and it can be really, really debilitating. So the anxiety that year was really bad, and I did get back into therapy, which it's so interesting how this is another thing that I want to talk about, just how mental health issues, a lot of good can come out of them. We can learn so much about ourselves and who we are and who we want to be through our struggles. And it was actually the anxiety that shaped the rest of my career. So while I was in college, around this time, I took my first psychology class. I was helped so much by my counselor that I decided I wanted to be a counselor. I changed my major to psychology. I got involved in psychology club, all sorts of things like that. So it really led to me unintentionally becoming an author. And I say unintentional because I didn't set out in life wanting to be an author, or even in any point in my career thinking about that, until I started finding through the years that I was being helped so much by this spiritual pathway called A Course in Miracles that I knew what I had to say and what I had to share could be of benefit to other people like me who tried many different therapeutic approaches. I tried therapy with a number of different counselors, NLP, which is something called neuro-linguistic programming. I got into meditation. I was trying all sorts of different approaches, and my anxiety issues were very existential. So although on the surface it looked like I had illness anxiety or panic disorder, what was fueling it deep down was a fear, a very deep fear about death and why are we here? What is the point of all of this? You know, why, if they say that saying, God is love, if God is love, how could a loving God create things that die? Like that just didn't make any sense to me. So I needed a remedy that met me at the depth of where it was that my anxiety was coming from. And for me, a metaphysical pathway, a spiritual pathway was the way to get down to that core of where the anxiety was coming from. So I could share a lot more, but I'm just wondering if there's anything that you want to respond to.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that one of my favorite teachers says there's nothing more practical than true spirituality. And when you talk about A Course in Miracles, it's not just a spiritual study, it's a psychological study. It's a description of what we do with our mind energy to create our emotions. And so the kinds of tools that you pull out of it in my work as a psychologist, when I find a book like yours, I want to find out, okay, how did you go into this spiritual book and come out with such solid psychological principles, and how have they helped you?
Oh, I love that question. So, A Course in Miracles is a psycho-spiritual text. Just like you described, it is both. It's working with our thoughts, it's working with our sense of spirituality. And I do have to admit that for anybody unfamiliar with A Course in Miracles, it is a book. It has three parts. There's a text, a workbook, and a manual for teachers. And if anyone has ever opened this book, particularly into the text, it's kind of like another language. You open it and it's like, what in the world is this talking about? My approach with working with this material, well, I was lucky because I had a parent, my mom, who was already studying the course, so she was able to help me understand some things. But my approach was really to just read, not worry about what I didn't understand, and what did make sense is always what motivated me to keep studying. So I didn't worry about what I didn't get. I trusted that I would get it in time, and I focused on what I did understand. And what I did understand immediately is that A Course in Miracles is teaching us that we are love. That's who we are. That's what we are made of. That is at our core. But we've put layers and layers of fear on top of that love. So we're no longer aware of it. We're no longer directly connected to that love because of all the layers of fear that we have in the way. So my approach, again, as I said, was really just to tackle it one step at a time, take what I could understand, but really apply it. So as I mentioned, A Course in Miracles has a workbook in it. There's a lesson every day for 365 days. And I started doing it. I started actually doing those lessons and doing what it said. And in the workbook, it actually says you don't have to believe these statements. You don't have to understand them. You can even actively resist them. Just do them. Just try them and let the results speak for themselves. So it was in the trying. And by the way, the 365 lessons that are meant to be done in a year, it took me 4 years to get through them the first time. So I had a lot of resistance and I prioritized other things and I just went with it. I just allowed myself to just be in the flow and again, trusted the process. And what I would find is that by doing it, doing the lessons, doing what the course says, you start to have experiences that reinforce what you're learning. So experiences show up in your life that teach you that, hey, something's happening here, something's working here. And it was through those experiences of having, for instance, shifts in perception. So A Course in Miracles talks about miracles, and we think of miracles as like poof, something appearing out of thin air. But miracles, according to A Course in Miracles, are expressions of love and shifts in perception. And we know how to do both of those. We have all experienced what it's like to have a reframe, to think about something differently. We've all experienced both giving and receiving, hopefully, expressions of love. And it's through working with these mind shifts and also these expressions of love that what awakens in us is an awareness of the truth of who we are, which is love, which is not a body, which is something connected to everything and eternal. And that awakens this process of miracles, of working miracles, awakens the truth in us and it awakens the truth in others as well. So did I answer your question about how
Yeah, you're beginning. And one of the things that I want you to get into, if you will, is how you put together in this book a system. I mean, you actually have, there are, aside from just doing the Course in Miracles lessons one a day for an entire year, one of the things I like, and the reason I can refer your book so easily to some patients, is you provide a series of steps.
Mhm.
And my other question is, how did you get from this basically spiritual text, which at times can be circular in its wording and confusing to some people at the conscious logical level. How'd you get from that to this system that you've put together that's working so well for you?
Gotcha. So I would say, honestly, by my own experience, by living the lessons, living the things that I was learning, what I started doing. So, A Course in Miracles, to give you a specific example, talks about our inner guidance system. A Course in Miracles calls it the Holy Spirit. I call it your inner therapist in my book. And so I started developing a relationship with this part of myself, and it's a part that we all share. And what I mean by developing a relationship is that I would start asking for guidance in the middle of the day. I would start saying, okay, spirit, okay, inner therapist, I'm feeling really lousy today. I'm really wanting a shift to come. I'm open. What can I do? And through developing that relationship, I started having a better sense of listening to guidance. And through guidance, I would get these ideas of, for instance, in my book, I talk about the importance of using a journal and I mean, journaling is nothing new, but using a journal to get out every single fear. As A Course in Miracles says, we're asked to turn our fears over to spirit and ask for miracles instead, those shifts. I started using my journal to what I would call journal dump, get everything out. And then I would come to a place of an open clearing. And it would be at that point that I would be able to listen better. I'd be able to tune into the love that was in me. And it was when I was in this space of love that it would reinforce what I just did to get there. I could see how what I just did with this example of journaling, how it helped me so much. So of course, that was what I was going to write about in the book. I have journal prompts throughout the book. The inspiration that came with a lot of the steps and the shifts was really born out of the process that A Course in Miracles teaches, with turning to our inner teacher, asking for a shift, and then trusting that it's done, trusting that that shift is going to come when we're ready to receive it. So,
Well,
the steps.
let me interrupt you there,
Mm-hmm.
and add from my experience. You said that shift is going to come when we're ready to receive it. And my experience is the shifts are always happening. And it's just a matter of, am I going to slow down, calm down the fears in me, calm down the racing thoughts in me to see them? And if I'm in a panic or if I'm in a rage, I can't really see all of the beautiful subtleties, what Jung would call synchronicities, the flow of life unfolding, that some would say in every moment have opportunities for integration and growth and extending the loving energy that you are. What's coming to my mind now is, in your book, you talked about a recurrence of this fear about medical issues and having to go in for, I think it was a blood test. Do you remember that story?
Mm-hmm. I do.
And the synchronicities that happened. Can you tell us?
Yes. So as I mentioned already, illness anxiety was a big deal. And needles, anything in that medical realm were all very much triggers for me. And I 100% agree with you that these things are happening all the time. The shifts, the synchronicities, but we don't stop and slow down to notice them. So we are 100% on the same page. With this particular story you're referencing, this was an experience that I share in the book because it was such a foundational experience in building my trust in my inner guidance system, building my trust in the fact that we do not walk alone. And this was many years ago now, and I was in a doctor's office. I had decided to investigate a symptom that I'd had my whole life. So I went to a doctor's office while I was in the room where the nurse was drawing blood, drawing my labs. She was like, "So why are you here?" And I told her. I said, "I have this symptom." And she goes, "Oh, that's not good." And then I was like, well, it's a symptom I've had my whole life. I was trying to like downplay it. And she goes, well, that's not good. And then she goes, don't you pass out on me. So guess what I did? That her wording, the fact that she's doing my labs right there, her concern, her words spiked my anxiety. I had the vasovagal response where I started to pass out, and they had to put up my feet, and they brought me juice and gummy worms to bring my blood sugar back up. And I could have gone down the road of saying she was a lousy nurse, and one could argue, that there's a mindfulness that is really helpful when
Right.
you're working with anxious patients.
There are better things to say than
Right. But rather than blame, so rather than say, she is the one who did this to me, knowing what I knew at that time from my studies of A Course in Miracles, I chose instead to take responsibility for that situation that I was already fearful. And I called her forth as a witness to solidify my fear, to justify my fear. I sent out a little, vibe, and she agreed to play this role to solidify my fear that was already in my mind. So I was willing to go to this place of taking responsibility, seeing her as a witness that I hired. And instead of condemning and blaming, I chose to take that responsibility and to start talking to spirit and saying, I want a miracle instead. I don't want to do this again. That sucked. That was not fun. Because what happened was that in that same appointment, I went and I saw the doctor, and he wrote a prescription for me to get even more lab work done, this time at a hospital outpatient clinic instead of like in the office. So that was an even bigger trigger for me, was to have to go to a hospital to get a test done. So I was freaking out, is the basic, is a simple way of putting it. Even though I was still anxious, I was still talking to my inner guidance system. I was still talking to spirit and saying, last time I called forth witnesses for fear. This time I'm still scared, but I want to call forth witnesses for love. That is my intention. That's what I want. And I was just praying and meditating, even though I was still scared, walking into the door of this hospital. So I go in, and when I enter, the woman behind the front desk, I look at her and I realize it's the mom of a college roommate. Actually, when I was having panic attacks, my suite mate, she was in the same suite that year in college. So it was her mom behind the desk, and I just immediately relaxed, and I was so happy to see her. And I didn't know she was a nurse. I thought she was just a receptionist. When it was my turn, she called me. She walked me in the back, and I was like, "Oh, you are a nurse?" And she's like, "Yes, I'll be doing your lab draw." So we sat there. She did the lab draw, it took a while because it was an extensive test. We chatted about my friend's kids. There was no pass out response, no anxiety response. And as I was leaving, now this is the part that still to this day gives me goosebumps. As I was leaving the clinic, she stopped and she said to me, it was a Monday. She said, "Corinne, it's amazing that you came in today. I never work on Mondays, and I was called in 30 minutes before you showed up." And that gives me goosebumps, because that to me was such a foundational block in my new trust foundation, rather than my termite infested fear foundation, that showed me that this work works. It works for me, that we have a thought system outside of our fearful thought system, this loving thought system that we can tap into, that we can tune into, that will teach us who we are, that is gentle. And here's the thing. This is what I'm really talking about, is a shift in identity. So my fearful small self identity as Corinne has every reason to be anxious. Like, there's a million reasons to, just turn on the news. The latest outbreak, of the latest disease is currently happening. There's many reasons to be anxious. But when we start to have experiences like this, and we can learn from each other, like, just when I hear other people's experiences, it strengthens my trust. I hope that story strengthens another person's trust. When we hear these experiences, we start to shift our identity. I like to think about it from a lowercase s self to a capital S self. We start to identify with that love that we are. We identify less as this separate sense of self, and anxiety has to fall away in that space. When we are connected to who we truly are, when we are in that love that we really are, anxiety cannot exist. So that is my core message.
Well, and I think that one of the things you're highlighting there is that that fearful part of my mind is there, and what it's seeing is there at some level. However, we lose track of the fact that our five senses only register a tiny bit of what's actually going on, because we understand that our eyes only see a small bit of the light spectrum. We call it the visible part of the spectrum. Our ears only hear a small bit of the range of vibrations. Dogs hear different frequencies. Whales and elephants hear differently. Not only that, but our conscious logical mind only registers a tiny fraction of what our senses are picking up. So one of the things that I get, and like what you do in your book, is to bring these steps, like there's a section in your book, 5 steps to handing it over. You actually give people steps to exercise the ability to tune into something other than what our culture conditions us to, which is basically just pay attention to the physical, the mental, the conscious logical. And there's so much more going on. And you outline how to tap into that with a whole series of steps. You mentioned that you have meditations, action step recaps, mind strengthening mantras, and journal prompts. And I love that system, especially for people who like a little bit of structure. And years ago, before we learned all the mind body energy stuff in psychology, one of the things we would do, or basically the only thing we had for people other than give them a heavy tranquilizer, was to give them a series of steps, help them create it for themselves, series of steps of things they could do with their conscious logical mind, just to focus on what they have control over. And I think what you've done with these steps in your book is expand that and weave in the Course in Miracles
Yeah.
principles.
And I'll add to that, all of these steps and shifts, these are what I did to heal. That's really where this all comes from. This is what I just intuitively was given, and intuitively, but also, again, it's very based on A Course in Miracles. These things were what helped me work out of the anxiety. And my heart just fills up with hearing people's stories who are working. Everybody says, oh, I realize this is a book that I'm not just going to read once. This is a system. This is something I need to work. And the stories that I hear from people who are doing this work just absolutely fill my heart. I was just speaking with someone the other day who was surprised that she's really been engaging with my book for quite some time and with the course. Her dental anxiety fell away. My book is not about dental anxiety, but it was one of just the benefits that happens. That's been my experience too, is that I've found unexpected healings have happened. My book is not about healing anxiety on an airplane, but I was shocked to find that engaging in this work, one day I had a flight to fly from New Jersey, where I live, to California. And I was like, something's different. Like, what's missing? And I was like, wait, I'm not anxious. I'm not anxious at all. I'm completely comfortable, both leading up to the flight and on the flight itself. So although my book is targeting anxiety, I talk about illness anxiety, really anxiety in general, it's amazing to see just what can fall away when we are really engaging in this healing work. Unexpected things can fall away.
Yeah, and I like the idea that with structure, people with anxiety can find something to hold on to. And at the same time, what you point to is one of the big things in Course in Miracles, which is to let go of this sense of I have to control everything and ask to be shown. So one of the things that we worked on for years with people in therapy is because of any kind of trauma, people end up getting cut off at the neck and they just stay up in their head and they literally tune out physical body sensations, intuitions, early warning signals. So they'll walk into a room and 3 or 4 people will ask them what's wrong. And they'll say, what do you mean? And they'll think, I'm fine. And they've literally tuned out that their hands are shaking or there's a tremor in their voice, or people can see in their facial expressions that they're furrowed brow. So you're kind of providing this step-by-step series of tools, expanding on what Course in Miracles asks us to do, helps me see people tune in more to this wider range of things that their physical, emotional, energetic system is providing that our culture teaches us to ignore. So I want to give you a chance to talk about either another story from your growth or one of the people you've worked with who's had a shift and how that happened.
Can I just address, before we go there, can I address one thing that you just said? Because you hit on something really important about being up in our heads and cut off from our bodies. One of the number one questions that I often get is, how do I tune into guidance? Like, I don't hear a loving voice. I don't hear guidance. And how do I do that? And so there is a part in my book where I am addressing a podcast of someone who I interviewed that was just so helpful, because if you think of a radio, actually, if you think of an old school radio that used to have knobs, we don't have knobs anymore, but let's think about an old radio where you had to turn the knob and you tune in different frequencies. We wouldn't listen to a hip hop radio station and get mad at it if it's playing country music. What would we do? If we want to hear country music, we just change the channel. So the fearful voice is coming in. It's typically, for me, very up in my head, like you described. That's one channel. To tune into guidance, we have to tune into a different channel. And oftentimes that channel is in our body. It's somewhere, for me, it's like kind of in the core of my chest. And so in the book, there is an exercise, and I'm referencing this podcast with a gentleman that I interviewed his name is John Mark Stroud. The ability to tune in to guidance means we have to be able to tune into our bodies. So I just wanted to really emphasize what you just said and the importance of starting to tune in rather than tune out, because we will feel those intuitive hits in our body, not necessarily in our head.
Well, let's stay with that for a minute and expand on it. One of the things that I come to a lot with people is when they tune in to the body and they have any kind of an uncomfortable sensation, anxiety or anger going on, and then they'll judge themselves harshly. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling this. I've already done the 365 days. I've already read Corinne's book. And I love the work of Sylvia Boorstein. She's a Jewish Buddhist grandmotherly type person who says whenever she's upset, she puts her hand over her heart space and talks gently to herself and says, Sylvia, sweetheart, you're in pain. Take a few deep breaths. Then we'll look at what's going on and then we'll decide what to do. But for now, Timmy, sweetheart, you're in pain. And it's so common for me to be working with people who've made tremendous progress, and then they'll have a day where they're feeling anxious or stuck, and they get viciously angry with themselves. So I love that idea of just comforting myself, recognizing that any negative emotion is uncomfortable, and if I act from it, I'm just going to make my situation worse. So I want to be gentle, focus inside, and then apply the tools again.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I talk about the importance of non-judgment in my book, because what the process you just described is such an ego trap that we get caught in with self-judgment, and that keeping us in that fearful thought system. If we can instead allow ourselves to be where we are, exactly where we are, with whatever it is that's happening, that allowing, that giving ourselves permission to be where we are, whatever is happening, even if we would judge it as not desirable, that will help us move through that situation. And there's actually a quote in A Course in Miracles that I love. And it says, there's so many quotes, but what this particular quote says, that a happy learner cannot feel guilty about learning. A happy learner cannot feel guilty about learning. So whatever learning it is that's coming up, we have to see it as a learning opportunity and not beat ourselves up for where we are, because that will help us grow. That will help us learn. Thank you for bringing that up.
My pleasure. So take a breath, get yourself oriented, and what have I not even begun to touch on that you want to share with the audience?
Well, I'd like to go back to your question from before about sharing another story, either my own story or someone else's story. And at the moment, I feel moved to just share a story. And it's not going to be as powerful coming out of my words, coming out of my mouth. You can actually hear this story out of Natasha's own experience, her own words, on a recent podcast episode that I did, where the title of the podcast is called Shoulders Back, Boobies Out, Facing Fear with Spirit. So when my friend Natasha, I had her on my podcast, and she is the one that I just referenced who reported that her dental anxiety has fallen away as a result of really engaging with the course and really doing the work in my book. And in this podcast, she talks about getting very serious with my book, with the course. And to reference what you just mentioned, it's not the type of thing where we do the steps once. I cannot tell you how many times I have been through the steps in this book for my own healing, because fear layers come up. They just come up to be healed. That's why they come up. And so each time they come up, we have an opportunity to work the steps again. So it's not like we just do the steps once and say, oh, I did that, it didn't work. We have to engage on a regular basis. So she was engaging and started having panic attacks. We tend to think that when we get in a spiritual path, our healing will be linear. It will just be like one smooth ride up. And sorry, it's up and down and twisting and all around. It's kind of messy. And she got my book because she started having panic attacks at a very, she had already been a course student for quite some time. So it was surprising to her. And she was prompted through having worked with the steps in my book one night when the anxiety was coming up really strong, to sit, and she's British. She has a beautiful British accent, with her shoulders back and boobies out and facing fear head on. Because what do we do when we are feeling like fear is caving in? We cave, we protect ourselves. We want to protect our heart. But she was prompted to do the opposite and to sit with the fear while looking at it with spirit. Now, this is another thing that I talk about in my book a lot as well, is that we, as I said already, what is coming up to be healed. Therefore, it needs to be seen and it needs to be taken to the light. So bringing it to spirit is what I talk a lot about. And that means that at times it might mean that we need to sit with it. We need to feel that feeling rather than running away from it. So she sat with her anxiety. She sat with the feelings of panic that were coming up. And at this point, she did feel safe enough. She had enough trust in her inner guidance system to feel that she wasn't doing this alone. And to do, as I said in the book, to be looking at the fear with spirit, to imagine that your inner guide is right there with you, looking at the fear, because it's less scary to look at it alone than it is, it's less scary to look at it together than it is to look at it alone. And what she found was remarkable. Her fears, her panic fizzled away, And as a result of doing that work, she started finding all of these other synchronicities show up in her life. She had a trip coming up that just was filled with synchronicities. She had been wanting a new wardrobe and connected with her sister, and her sister had a trunk full of like brand new gorgeous clothes for her. And she described some of these synchronicities in her interview. So that's just an example that I wanted to share of doing the work and really seeing that it's not easy, but that the outcome of doing this work can be extremely fruitful and such a help in laying yet another stone in our foundation of trust, rather than continuing to stand on that termite-infested foundation of anxiety, which is what I like to call it.
Yeah, I have the habit of telling people that it's so much more productive for me in my life to live from direct observation than it is to live from belief or faith or dogma. And so here's an observation. I don't know everything yet. And since I don't know everything yet, whatever it is I think I know is either only partially true, just by direct observation, and some of it's perhaps completely false. If I take that attitude into a new situation, I have the potential to learn something new. And in any situation that has something really important or deep to teach me, I need to go at it with that observation that I don't know everything yet many times over. Because each time I go back to a book like yours or the Course in Miracles, I'm different. So what I take from it is different. Where I am in my journey is different. And I really like the idea that as someone, as you mentioned, she had worked through this before, worked through the course, and then found your book. So she was building a level of strength within herself. And there are many people, many of us, who when we first start on a journey like this, it's not possible for us to sit with the level of pain and intensity we have. We need a support system. We need somebody to lean on who can guide us, assure us that we're not going to go crazy and not be able to come back. And with that kind of support in a book like yours over time with multiple repetitions, we can develop the inner strength. So eventually we can get to the place where we can sit in the panic and realize it's just energy and take learnings from it rather than run from it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. I completely agree. And I would like to just highlight and pick up on what you're saying with recognizing that we don't know much of what's going on. We know so little, as you described earlier. And that's one of the lessons in A Course in Miracles that has been so helpful to me. It talks about just, we don't know anything. I know nothing. I don't know what anything is for. That's the lesson. That's the specific lesson. I don't know what anything is for. And I don't. And that's the problem. Anxiety has this way of making us feel like we can prevent the anxiety, we can prevent bad things from happening if we are in control. And yet that's where we spiral out of control. That's where fear takes over and we just lose ourself. We lose that connection with our capital S self. Instead, when we come into that space of recognizing that I don't know anything, I don't know what anything is for, that's where we gain control back. That's where we reconnect with that capital S sense of self, that love that's within us, and then are open and attuned to all the synchronicities and the miracles that have been there waiting to be acknowledged. So I'm really glad that you brought this piece up, because it's so important about being willing to stay in this space of, I don't know what anything is for. And I could have easily, and I probably did back when the panic first started, you wish it away. You don't want to feel that way. We want all this difficult stuff to go away. But I never could have predicted the good that could come out of having suffered with so much anxiety. I am more peaceful now and happier now than I have ever been in my life. And to be able to birth a book with the tools that helped me and now be able to turn around and help others, there is nothing more, there's no other purpose on the planet that I would want. To be able to extend these teachings and share with others is such an incredible honor and such an incredible gift. So a lot of good can come out of our struggles, if especially too if we can just remember that we don't know what anything is for, and we can repurpose our struggles to be used for healing and to possibly even help others.
Well, and I love the idea that community helps people find the strength, and you can borrow that strength from others until you have it for yourself. You mentioned a podcast, and I think I remember something about you doing a weekly call. Do you still do that? Tell us a little bit
Yes.
about your website and your book and your podcast and ways people can reach out to you.
Thank you. So everything, the hub of what I do is available through my website, which is FromAnxietyToLove.com, my book title. And I offer a lot of different things that you can find immediately through the website. I have my podcast. So it is a podcast where I release about 2 episodes per month. And that's at FromAnxietyToLove.com/podcast. It's on Apple Music and Spotify and YouTube. And the podcast is an opportunity for me to share things that I'm learning. So I have solo episodes where I share insights, synchronicities, things that have occurred that have built my trust in hopes that it will help others build their trust as well. And then I do also interview people occasionally who have been healed because of A Course in Miracles. They've struggled with their own mental health issues in some way, or are course teachers, and the interviews are just fantastic. So that podcast is always available. In addition, you mentioned the study group. So for 8 years now, I've been offering a totally free Course in Miracles study group on Sunday nights. We meet from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, and we've been just reading a section at a time, sometimes only a paragraph at a time per night, because we discuss what we read. So it's a wonderful opportunity to connect with community, because these are very dedicated course students, although many people are new, some come, some go. So we are a international group. I currently have members from Australia, somewhere in Asia. I'm blanking on the country at the moment. I had someone calling in for a while from Siberia. So we're an international group, and it's just so wonderful to be able to share our experiences, because again, they strengthen the learning for all of us. So when someone on the call shares a shift that they had, a miracle that they experienced, it helps all of us. So that is another offering that folks can find through my website. I have a free 3-part crash course on healing anxiety with A Course in Miracles. So it's almost like an introduction to my work and how this all works. So that's available too. Obviously, I have the book, which you mentioned already. I'm also coming out this coming spring with a From Anxiety to Love masterclass. So this will be an 8-week masterclass that's based on the teachings of my book, but we'll go a bit deeper. We'll go into some things that I didn't include in the book in terms of some stories and some deeper teachings of the course, and there'll be a live component as well. So it's an opportunity for folks who either have started or haven't yet started the book, but who want to be able to have conversation with me about what it is that they're learning. So that class, that's a paid class that'll be coming out this spring. And again, there'll be information on my events tab.
What's the format? You say an 8-week class. Is it going to be once a week for 8 weeks?
So it will be video modules that will be released each week. And those will be released once a week for 8 weeks. However, there will be live calls throughout the 8 weeks. So there'll be, basically it's going to work out to about 6 weeks of online modules and 2 weeks of live calls where we will connect in person. And of course, Facebook group support and things like that outside of the class. So it's mostly, it is on the computer, online, some pre-recorded video and some live. But the pre-recorded video, I'll have to say, there'll be an interactive piece to that as well. So it's currently in development.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I appreciate your being willing to share and all the work you've done and how it's helping others. And thank you for joining us today on Journey's Dream.
Thank you so much. It was such an honor. I really appreciate it, and love to all. And if I could just leave folks with one sentence, I want to just remind everybody that the light in you is too bright to fail.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to have you here.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.